Hello, everyone. We are live. My name is Martin van Staden. I am the head of policy here at the Free Market Foundation. I am joined by Zakhele Mthembu, our policy officer. And today is an important day because we are launching our next paper in our Liberty First policy agenda. But more than that, today is the publication of the quarterly labor force survey, the QLFS, by Statistics South Africa. They will be starting that as we speak now in about half an hour, 20 minutes. That's when they'll publish the actual survey. So we're all monitoring that. Unfortunately, we at the Free Market Foundation have developed a magic ability, and that magic ability allows us to see into the future. And as we sit here half an hour before the QLFS is published, we can say with 100% confidence that the unemployment problem in South Africa has not been resolved. And that is what the QLFS will bear out. So whatever statistical change has occurred, there has been no structural changes in unemployment. There have been no policy changes in labor law that are very notable in recent years, certainly not under the government of national unity. So we don't expect much to change in this regard. And that is why the Free Market Foundation has launched this Liberty First project, specifically after the establishment of the government of national unity last year, on 5 areas: size of government, regulation, legal system and property rights, trade, and the value of the currency. These are kind of the 5 reform areas that we looked at. And this year we've been diving deeper into various aspects of those proposals that the Free Market Foundation has put forward. And today we're discussing specifically the FMF's proposal to address South Africa's unemployment crisis. And I'm increasingly starting to think that describing it as a crisis doesn't even do it justice anymore. That is why we have taken to, I think, the appropriate descriptor as used in the title of the paper, what you can see on your screen now, is the time bomb of unemployment in South Africa. Zake's paper is titled Defusing the Joblessness Timebomb, Restoring Dignity and Choice Through Labour Regulation Exemption. So that's a mouthful, but it does capture the essence of what the Free Market Foundation's proposal is. And spoiler, it's all about freedom and choice and letting people, getting government out of the way of people to make their own lot in life and to liberate themselves from that lot. So without too much further ado, if you're from the press, please post your questions in the comments. Identify yourself if you are from the press. You can also WhatsApp them to us if you feel that necessary, and we'll take those questions after Zake has given us an overview of his paper. So that will happen now. That'll be about 10-15 minutes, and then we'll get into a brief discussion. So thank you to everyone joining us rather than joining the QLFS. Someone recently said that diagnostic is easy, kind of the prognosis and the treatment. That's the difficult part, and that's the important part, and that's what we're doing. So to everyone joining us here live, thank you very much. We appreciate it, and let's hope that some of these ideas do find purchase amongst our policymakers. Zakes, over to you.
Well, thank you, Martin. Thank you for the cool introduction, and welcome to everyone who's joining us and not joining the QLFS, as Martin has so rightly pointed out. But yeah, as has been said, right, as I think we all know, South Africa, we are in the midst of a national emergency, really, when it comes to unemployment, right? Official unemployment sits at above 33%. We don't know what the new numbers will be with the QLFS happening right now, but I think really we are looking at still an unemployment rate of above 30% officially, right? The expanded rate of unemployment, which includes people who have been discouraged from seeking work, right? This is something that I think we don't talk about a lot. unemployment is so rife in our country that we have people who just give up on seeking it. And we know that like you need to be employed to be able to sustain yourself, and just at the dignity level to see yourself as being responsible for your own life, right? It is something that is very empowering. And we have people who have been discouraged by that. But that rate sits at like 42.9%, that rate of unemployment. And then among young people, which are our future really, but that our future looks bleak if you look at the unemployment rate, because the rate soars to over 46%, and young people includes people aged from 15 to 35%. But within that cohort, right, you even have younger people 15 to 24. The rate of unemployment among those people is well over 50%. It is 62%. That is really the core of South Africa's future, that is largely unemployed. This is the crisis that we have. This is the time bomb that we are sitting on, because what does this bode for our future when we have such swaths, right? This is like, the figures are all nice. I'm not as mathematically gifted as most would be, but I think whittling them down to like, actual tangible figures. The unemployment rate means over 11 million South Africans are like out of the formal economy. These are human beings, right, with potential and dreams, and they are locked out of work. And the cruel irony of all of that is that the very labor laws that the South African state and a lot of its supporters would say are meant to protect these people who are out of work, these are the reason that these people are unable to seek or get employment, right? Laws like the national minimum wage, rigid dismissal procedures, and collective bargaining extensions have become barriers, right, instead of bridges. And they make it illegal for someone to say, I'll take that job at a particular wage. And if that wage happens to be lower than the minimum wage, well, then they are out of luck, right? It means their occupation or their employment will be illegal. So what is the solution? The solution that we talk about in the paper is a policy proposal that was developed by our president at the Free Market Foundation, Mr. Eustace Davey, the great Mr. Eustace Davey. And that solution is the Job Seekers Exemption Certificates, right? Or JSEC. And this is a simple and moral response, I would like to say, to this crisis of unemployment that we were just talking about. And how it works is anyone who's been unemployed for 6 months or longer can walk into their local municipality and walk out with a free certificate, right? A JSEC. And for 2 years, the certificate exempts that person from all labor laws, the minimum wage, hiring and firing restrictions, racial equity quotas, bargaining council extensions, everything, right? With it, the unemployed can finally say, I choose to work on my terms, not on the state. And this is something that's pretty important to me as like a legal scholar, right? The state, through labor regulations, pretty much acts as a third party to every contract. And beyond the scope of like the legality of a particular contract, right? The scope has been expanded, whereby what is considered to be within the scopes of legality entails inhibiting the inherent natural rights of the contracting parties. And I think that is something that should not be accepted. But with the JSEC, right, the unemployed can finally say, I choose to work on my terms. And most importantly, employers, the people who are responsible, who will be largely responsible for eliminating the unemployment crisis, they get protection from prosecution for hiring JSEC holders. And the process is simple, voluntary, and corruption resistant, right? And the corruption resistant part, I think, is pretty important to me. And this is really borne out by the fact that you can just walk into your local municipal office and really walk out with a certificate. The process will be relatively simple. You'll just have to verify that you've been unemployed for 6 months or more. And this is decentralized throughout all the hundreds of municipalities throughout the country, instead of like it being centralized in the Department of Labor, whereby it will be easy, right? As we all know, centralization makes corruption much more easier. But with decentralization, it means that for someone to want to effect the implementation of the policy, they would have to try and influence 100+ municipalities all across the country, which is much more harder to do than influencing one national government department, right? Now then, the JSEC is meant to target what I believe, and really what research bears out as the true creators of now, employment. The JSEC channels opportunity to where jobs are truly created. This is in households and small businesses. As we know, small businesses are the engines of most, if not all, economies, as commentators would usually say. So under the JSEC model, households could hire up to 2 JSEC holders, micro enterprises up to 5, small firms up to 25 JSEC holders, and medium businesses up to 100 125. So this is meant to protect larger unionized sectors while freeing up millions of like potential entry-level positions. And the protection of the unionized sectors is not because I hold any brief for unions whatsoever, right? So we could write another paper on the problems that organized labor has caused in the South African labor market, but it is so that the viability and the implementation of a policy like JSEC, which is desperately needed, is even acceptable to organized labor itself, because it would not be subject, like larger firms, like in mining and things like that, would have a much more harder time implementing a policy like JSEC in comparison to smaller firms. And that is what you want, really. We want the smaller firms to be the ones that benefit the most, because the small firms, the small businesses, the households, that is where the economy is. That is where most productive activity happens in any economy. And that is what we need to make it much more easier, right, for those people with capital, with the means to hire the people that need hiring. Now then, the economic rationale of the JSEC is pretty much, if you are a regular watch of the Free Market Foundation, you would know really that minimum wages or wage floors or wage ceilings, that is, wage floors, create artificial costs, right? So they skew demand. When you raise the price of labor, employers hire less of it. This is pretty much the basic, rule of supply and demand. You make something more expensive, people will want less of it. If something is more expensive, less people will buy it. And in the case of labor is more expensive by default through the national minimum wage, and that makes it less attractive, right? And just to show the correlatory effect, right, of like the national minimum wage itself, when South Africa introduced it in 2019, the unemployment rate was 28%, and now it is over 33%, as we've mentioned, at least official unemployment rate. And now, of course, we had COVID in between that, which may have skewed the economic data because the government willingly shut down the economy. So that is also at the feet of the state itself. But the correlation is clear, and also the structural causes of that unemployment, which are the labor regulations that the minimum wage is just one part of, right, have been there and are the reason that even in 2019, our unemployment rate was at 28%, which is considered very high for an economy like ours, right? And then if you compare that to the employment tax incentive, right, which gave employers tax breaks for hiring youth. It didn't solve everything, but it did increase hiring. And policies like that is what JSEC is pretty much modeled after, giving employers incentives to hire people. And in the case of JSEC, by eliminating compliance costs. Now, the JSEC takes that logic one step further, right? As I said, instead of cutting costs, it eliminates the compliance costs entirely. Instead of cutting taxes, that is, it eliminates compliance costs entirely. And studies from the OECD, IMF, and South African researchers, like in universities like Stellenbosch, confirm that when you lower hiring costs, right, employers hire more people, especially the young and the unskilled, which, as we mentioned earlier on, that makes up a large part of the South African unemployed population. And while training programs, which is what a lot of people are in favor of, right, they sound good on paper, they don't solve everything. They don't solve the structural problems, that is, right, in the South African economy, because the structural problems are the legal barriers that make work unaffordable, or that make hiring unaffordable for employers. That is what we need to solve. That is the cause of our unemployment. As in the paper, I have a bunch of evidence that bears this true. Now then, since, as I mentioned, that I'm a legal scholar, one would mention that we have labor legislation that is derived, or that is seen as an expression of Section 23, right, in the South African Constitution, which really is the right to fair labor practices. Now then, I would say that JSEC, right, because a critic would be like, hey, JSEC is pretty much unconstitutional because it says that all these rights that are expressed through, these labor legislation are invalidated. I would say that it affirms those rights because, the right to dignity, the freedom of choice to a profession, and the right to fair labor practices are affirmed through JSEC, right? The right to fair labor practices shouldn't mean that the unemployed are forbidden to work at wages that they freely accept. Fairness is subjective, and this is something that even the court itself, right, has really borne it true, that fairness is subjective, and what's fair for one person may not be fair for another, and this is just basic truth. What is fair for me is not fair to someone who lives in the Eastern Cape, in the Western Cape, who is in a different context and situation than me. Then the premise is, why should then you have legislation decide on a general basis all across the country, like as big as South Africa is, with the millions of people that it does have, what is fair for everyone and what is not fair, right? The Section 36 limitation clause, because JSEC will act as a limitation, as I've mentioned, that we have legislation that is an expression of Section 23, right? And would have to limit it using the Section 36 limitation clause. And the rationale really supports the implementation of JSEC. It allows reasonable limitations, as we know, when they're justifiable in an open and democratic society. And JSEC easily meets all the criteria of the limitation clause, right? It's a law of general application. It's voluntary. It's narrowly tailored to address the unemployment crisis. As we've mentioned, unemployment crisis is a structural crisis, and JSEC is a response to that structural issue by eliminating all of these compliance costs that make hiring much more harder, right? And most importantly, it advances dignity and equality by giving people control over their own livelihoods, right? Like as I've mentioned earlier, if you feel responsible, if you see yourself as being the one responsible for your prosperity, for your continuous survival on the planet, right? It does something for your dignity. It uplifts you on a general human level. And I think that is something that we should aspire to, at least at a collective level as a country. Now then, the implementation of JSEC, right? To make it real, Parliament should pass, pretty much the best way would be to pass a Job Seekers Exemption Certificate Act, right? Have a legislation that would be passed by the state, and that would pretty much actualize the realization of JSEC. And it would empower municipalities to issue certificates free of charge. Applicants would simply confirm that they've been unemployed for 6 months or more, and really that would be it, right? Employers who hire JSEC holders would keep simple contracts, basic details like wages, hours, and the duration of the employment of the parties, and both parties remain protected under common law, right? Even though we've eliminated statutory protections in the form of like the Labour Relations Act, Basic Conditions of Employment Act, National Minimum Wage Act, or the Employment Equity Act, even though we've removed those protections, there is still common law protection that is really subject to all employment contracts and has been established over centuries, and that JSEC holders will still be protected by that too. And to ensure fairness, right, the JSEC must be voluntary. This is something that is pretty important. People must choose to not be subject to these things, to emphasize the fact that they actually have the need and the desire to get employment, right? It must be voluntary. It must be revocable. If you have gotten it, you can say that I no longer want to be under the JSEC and go back to the normal statutory regime, and non-renewable too after 2 years, because the whole point is to get people into the job market, and once they're established in the job market, hopefully having acquired skills, they can then move on and get much more better paying jobs. And of course, the bigger fight would be to fight against the general labor environment. That is something that we will continue to do, but to address an immediate crisis, a time bomb, as the title of the paper says, we would need policies like JSEC. And as I said, it would be non-renewable after 2 years, right? And then the moral argument of it, as I've been kind of hinting on it really during the overview, is that, it is a moral question. What does it mean, right, to restore dignity in a country where millions are told that they cannot work unless the government approves the terms of their employment, right? So the JSEC is not charity to employers. Rather, I would like to see it as justice for the unemployed, right? It trusts that South Africans can make their own decisions about their own livelihoods, rather than begging politicians for jobs that will never come, right? As we all know, the politicians keep on promising us jobs. Our current president promised the creation of 2 million jobs, and I think the unemployment rate has risen consistently under his watch. So that is something really to think about. So by allowing people to earn, learn, and gain skills in the course of employment, we empower them to step into the formal economy with pride and self-reliance, which is something that's very important to me, the self-reliance aspects of it. So, South Africa's unemployment crisis is not inevitable. It is a predictable result of policies that, price the poor out of work. That is the end, even though the intention may not be that, right? Irrespective of the good intentions, the end of such policies is that the poor, the unskilled, the young, as we've mentioned, are priced out of the workplace. So the Job Seekers Exemption Certificates offers the way out of that, a bridge from, the despair of unemployment to the dignity of employment and self-reliance. Economic theory, constitutional principle, and moral conviction, which is, something that I've kind of been harping on about here, all point in the same direction, right? That JSEC is something that we should definitely pursue as a country, and we hope that our policymakers will find it in themselves to, implement something like this. So Yeah, I think that will be it.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, please put them in the comments, pop them over to us via WhatsApp. But let's get started, I guess, with what is immediately going to be the criticism, and one would always expect this. JSEC is going to allow workers to be exploited. Yes, it's only 2 years, but my goodness, these are going to be 2 years of intense exploitation. We have these laws to protect people, and JSEC is now going to take away this protection. What do you say to that, Jakes?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, you would understand why someone would think like that. But as libertarians, we all know that people are free to choose. But I think, really, as I've mentioned in the overview, and as the paper emphasizes, unemployment is the issue here, right? If you were to let us do something that is pretty impossible to do, gauge the level of exploitation, right? When you are unemployed, you are way more vulnerable to exploitation than when you are employed under exploitative conditions. And that is the core issue that we should look to solve, right? If South Africans choose to be unemployed, the JSEC exists and it can not subject them to the employment conditions or the employment regulations that make hiring them much more harder, then hey, then it would be their choice to do that. I would think that that is way more exploitative on the general longer term because they are just not accumulating any capital and improving their life conditions. But I would think if we were to choose the two, it is better to be employed than unemployed. This is something that is pretty standard. And if you actually look at the trajectory of the growth of certain economies, right? You look at China right now, wages used to be super low. They are rising in China. Their economy is growing. The Chinese are getting richer. I think the Chinese prefer the exploitation of the Deng Xiaoping era than the exploitation of the Mao Zedong era. I think it is pretty easy for them to choose, and I think this is a choice that we should allow South Africans to make. Right? Let's just give people the choice. If people choose to still not be unemployed, that's okay. But I have a feeling that a lot of people will choose to be employed.
Absolutely. And I think there is something there that South African activists often miss. So usually those kind of like you've pointed out the issue of the labor unions and kind of they uniformly approach this from, let's call it, a classical Marxist perspective. You have the proletariat, they are kind of low wage earners and they are being kind of exploited for their surplus value by the capitalists, and therefore you need the state to kind of provide these protections. Now, the problem is with importing a kind of 18th century kind of German doctrine into kind of modern day South Africa is that it makes certain kind of assumptions about the state of the economy. And the issue that we've kind of pointed out over many years, and which you point out in the paper again, is that these labor laws do not protect the unemployed. They are necessarily there for those who are employed. The unemployed is not part of the proletariat. They are not wage earners. So they exist in this kind of limbo, this kind of hidden spot in our society where you have those who are employed, they get labor protection. And then you have the kind of the invisible, the unemployed. And a lot of people are going to come against JSEC and say, but this allows exploitation, and that would be very intellectually dishonest of them because these people are not working. They are not benefiting from the protection of these laws. In fact, it is precisely those protections that, in large part, are keeping them unemployed. So this kind of just shows how one has to be very careful about. Kind of, we're very ideological at the FMF. We're liberals, we're libertarians. We think about these things on an ideas basis as well. But we are alive to reality. We understand that there's a context, and that's kind of the thing that I think our opponents also need to understand. The reality is, as you've now said, there are individuals, there are human beings out there starving, kind of succumbing to the elements because they are earning nothing, zero. And that's the immediate crisis that we need to solve. But kind of flowing from that, I think is the next question is like, we've mentioned the employment, the ITC, the ETI, the
Employment
employment
tax and
tax.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so some people might read that and think, okay, so you say this is kind of successful. So why not just kind of expand the tax incentive? Why do we need something as radical as the JSEC when we already have this less radical model that is already working? Why not just expand the employment tax incentive?
Firstly, I'd be like, as someone who wants lower taxes, let us expand the employment tax incentive. Why not, right? Do that, and also do JSEC. But really, the core of South Africa's structural unemployment, because we do have like an unemployment that refuses to budge, because we have the statutory provisions and statutes on our book that pretty much make it much more harder to hire someone, to fire someone. It makes the labor market less dynamic. So even though I would like the employment tax incentive to be expanded, I mean, hey, it's a tax break. Give people more tax breaks. But I think it does not solve the core of what causes unemployment in South Africa. It does not address that. And I think JSEC goes at the core of that. So I don't think it's an either or, really. Let's have both. I say let's have both. But in an ideal world, really, if I had to choose to solve unemployment, I would choose JSEC any day, because I think that it would have a much more bigger impact than the ETI had or is currently having.
Yeah, absolutely. When one speaks to kind of employers and would-be employers, but like foreign companies that might want to invest in South Africa, you always get the same story. Your labor laws are unattractive to kind of mass job production. It's very rare for them to say that, oh, you're too highly taxed. I think big companies kind of they're okay with taxes in South Africa. That's fine. So we always welcome tax breaks specifically because they make it more taxes make it more expensive for the end consumer at the end of the day. But the real reason we don't have mass employment in South Africa is because of the I think the uncertainty that our labor laws create. Like our labor laws, for example, say that like they have this assumption of good relations between employer, employee, and employee, and when those relationships crumble, which happens, this is something that it's normal, it happens, then automatically the employer is put at a significant disadvantage. There's talk about imbalance in bargaining power, but I think that equation has not been updated to the reality. If you were to ask me, I would say that in South Africa, employees have higher bargaining power today than employers do. Yes, on an individual to individual basis, that's not the case. But seen as a whole, definitely, labor has higher bargaining power in South Africa than employers. So that's not good. That's an imbalance, and you want there to be a balance. You want the bargaining power to be more appropriate there.
That's true. That's true. And to your point, right, on this imbalance between employer and employee, right, it is something that even when I was back in law school and I was doing labor law, I was like, man, this is a pretty much a bastardization of equality before the law, right? But I have come from a very different strain of thought when it comes to legal jurisprudence, because realists would be like, oh no, it's an appreciation of the reality of the situation rather than the form of it. But I'm like, no, like when you have a contract, having to consider other things other than what is agreed to in the contract is really stretching the courts way too far, because now you have to consider the position, which is really always a relative one between these two parties that they considered themselves before they contracted. So it's like a re-litigation of something that had already happened and trying to see if one is fair for the other. It is like it introduces so much subjectivity into the entire adjudication process, which is something that I don't agree with. But that is the legal scholar and me saying no to inequality before the law. But it is something, especially in labor law, that has just been accepted as fact, that certain people will be treated unequally when they come before the bench, and that is good. And I don't think that's something that is something we should celebrate. But yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean that's a very valid point, just about the integrity of law. And I mean the kind of the uncertainty that I mentioned. Like employers are very aware, kind of alive to this. Like our labor disputes get violent. I mean, this is just something you can't get around, and employers are not allowed to respond to that appropriately. Like if you have a mine or something, or a factory or whatever, and there's a strike and people burn your cars, your vehicles for your business, you're basically not allowed to do anything about that. You're not allowed to say, okay, well, goodness, I saw you burning my car, so you're out, you're fired. You have to go through a process, a very laborious CCMA process to get the person fired. And yes, I must say, the CCMA isn't the big bad in every instance. I happen to know that the CCMA is quite reasonable when you have the dispute before the CCMA, and the labor court tends to be reasonable, and all these things. It's reasonable, but it's a heavy cost in investment that you have to make to go through a long, laborious process. And yes, you'll win if you're on the right side of it, but it's the same with expropriation. People always say that, don't worry, you can always go to court. It's like, my goodness, no, you can't. You cannot impose that cost on an economy like South Africa's. And in labor, it is extra problematic, because we as South Africans want mass employment. This is not a kind of a individual based issue. We want millions of people to be taken up into the labor market. So in that is why you have to make the cost of labor, at least from the state side, as low as possible. The state needs to make the burden that it represents in that relationship as low as absolutely possible. So yeah, that's just something that I think few people appreciate. But I think, let me see if there is any questions. Okay, let me go to mine first. So this is, I think, a concern that some people would have. And you did mention kind of why we've taken the position that we have, but maybe just emphasize that again. So municipalities in South Africa are kind of the let's say, the hotbed of corruption nowadays. I think there's top to bottom corruption in South Africa. I think that's difficult to deny. But when people think of, oh, there's corruption, they immediately think of some municipal manager or some councillor taking a bribe, etc. So when people hear we're saying that municipalities have to be where job seekers go to get their JSECs, they might react and say, no, but there's too much corruption. The room for abuse of that process for municipalities would be too great. So maybe go over and re-emphasize again why we think it's more appropriate, in fact, to have it at that level.
No, like I think it's a valid concern, right? Given our like South African society, as you said, from top to bottom, from the warrant officer at the police station to the general, as we are finding out now, to the head ad hoc committee, like everyone is corrupt. But I think municipalities are the best way, because like we have a choice, right? It's either the Department of Labor, either national government or municipalities. But I think municipalities specifically because they're accessible to the people. Everyone can really, local municipalities, the way they are structured in South Africa, right, in their geographic terms, means that the people who live in certain areas can really drive. It's a day's, really a couple of hours drive at the most for most people. But as for some, really can be as quick as the 20-minute drive or 20-minute walk to your municipal offices or your local authority, right? Because you will then within the municipality have particular authorities where your ward offices or where you pay your water is, and you can go there to those offices and you can apply for the certificates. But the process itself, right, it is objective. There's no room for discretion, and I think this is the main point that eliminates corruption, because discretion is where we introduce, elements of subjectivity and for a window for kickbacks. But the standard itself is that you have to be unemployed for 6 months. Prove that by getting an affidavit at a police station, and there is no room for anyone who is making the determination to say no to you once you have that step, or to do anything really rather than fulfill the requirements of the statute itself. So really the municipality acts as an administrator more than anything else, right? It has the person taking the decision cannot make you have a JSEC by force in a particular municipality. And if you choose to have a JSEC and you meet the requirements of it, they cannot deny you, because they would be violating the law itself. So I think that, and too, right, when you then compare that between a national department, right, if you had the Department of Labor being the one responsible for this, then you'd be like, okay, maybe there's room, because once you capture the Department of Labor, once there's a rogue minister, they would not want to implement the policy, at least as it was designed to be implemented. But by diffusing, right, the responsibility to municipalities, as I mentioned in the overview earlier, you kind of make it so that if someone wants to stall the implementation of it, they would have to implement influence all these various municipalities across the country. Because, if one municipality does not want to implement it, another will implement it. Most likely, the people living there will get more jobs, and the people living in the municipality that doesn't be like, yo, why are you being so weird? So yeah, really, I think the municipalities are the best option to go, and that is why we went with them, really. And also the main point is that there's no discretion, so really that's what eliminates corruption at its core.
Okay, last question. I see there's one from the audience from Ayanda. He asks, would you say that the disparity in terms of employment in the informal economy between locals and immigrants ties into this discussion regarding regulation? I think this is an important thing that kind of comes up always when there's kind of xenophobic violence. The first thing a lot of people say is they're taking our jobs. Look at all these employed immigrants, specifically illegal immigrants, maybe. So maybe do you have anything to add on that? Is there any
Um,
insight that grants us?
Thank you. Thank you for the question to Ayanda, because I, man, this really cuts at the core of it, right? I wanted to speak more on it in the overview, but I was trying really to get the main thesis and the arguments of the paper really done. But I think that is the best example, because if you consider the amount, illegal immigrants are not subject to, statutory protections because they are in the country illegally. They cannot approach the courts as easily because then they are status of illegality becomes a contentious point. So really, these are people who usually are not subject to statutory provisions. Yet the mere fact that South Africans find it a problem that these people are employed, they are employed, meaning there are jobs in South Africa that are available to people who come from thousands of kilometers away with nothing to their name but a skill, right? So there are jobs in entry level positions, small businesses I've mentioned, restaurants, construction centers, small firms, all of these jobs are available. And the fact that illegal immigrants have them, it shows the effectiveness that JSEC could have. I remember having this conversation with someone who also mentioned this. I was like, instead of complaining about illegal immigrants being hired, like I want South Africans to also get the same opportunities as illegal immigrants to get the employment, right? If a South African chooses to get employed under those same conditions, I think any employer, any South African employer at least, right, would prefer to hire a South African. I really would not want anyone to prefer to hire anyone premised on nationality, but I think most people would, right? They would prefer to hire a South African because they are South African too. Culturally, it's much more easy. So like, but it is hard for these, small businesses, restaurants, any restaurant. Ask any restaurant owner. Like the reason they don't hire illegal immigrants because they hold any brief for them. They have, they are bleeding hearts trying to change the world. They are just businessmen who are seeking a profit, and the only available labor that is viable to them to make a profit is illegal immigrant labor. And I'm like, why make it hard? Why make it impossible for South Africans to also get those same opportunities? They complain, right? Like the whole reason behind xenophobic attacks is that they're saying these illegal immigrants are taking their jobs. I'm saying then go take the jobs, then implement JSEC, and then the jobs will be available to you. And I think that the economy will be much more better for it. So yeah,
Absolutely.
great question. Great
Mm.
question.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I think this ties back into kind of just understanding economics. You'll be very familiar with this, the idea that value is subjective. If you own a spaza shop and you find that you're wasting so much time cleaning, kind of sweeping the floors, and you would like someone else to sweep the floors, but you know that if you hire someone to do that, you are required by law to pay them minimum wage, let's say 2,500 Rand a month. It's very little, but that's not worth it to you. You don't get enough money in your business to pay someone at least 2,500 Rand a month to sweep your floors. So your value for that job exists somewhere between 0 and 2,500. And an illegal immigrant is going to say, listen, the minimum wage doesn't apply to me. I am willing to sweep your floors for 1,000 Rand a month. And you will be a rational, sensible, reasonable spaza shop owner if you then said, well, of course, I'm going to go with the illegal immigrant because that law does not apply to him because he's not actually here. He's an illegal immigrant. He doesn't exist. But if it's a South African, the only answer is no, I'm not giving you a job because you're too expensive. Now, activists in their air conditioned rooms Here in my office, we're not allowed to install air conditioning, so I don't count. But activists in their air-conditioned NGO rooms will say, no, no, you are being a bad person, spaza shop owner. How dare you? You must forget about your subjective value of what value sweeping the floors means to you, and pay them what Parliament is telling you to pay them. That is just not how it works. That is not how the world works. Value is subjective whether we like it or not. That is just how it's going to be in the most capitalist states of the world and in the most communist states of the world. It is a rule of nature that is inescapable. And the only reason why wealthy European states, Germany, Sweden, get away with minimum wages is because those are rich countries and the minimum wage is lower than what the economy is able to bear in most cases of employment. That is just not applicable in South Africa with its history of deprivation, of destitution, of dispossession. We are just not there yet. We want to get there, but we are not there yet. So yeah, I think Ayanda, thanks for that, and then thanks Jakes for that insightful answer. Really, this really cuts to the core of it. We need to start respecting the reality of how people view value and how the economy actually works, rather than what we might prefer how it would work under ideal circumstances.
I think that's a great point, right? The ideal versus the real, really, and when the two clash, I think the real will always prevail because the ideal exists in our head. And I think a whole lot of people, right, we want the world to look a certain way, as you said, these activists in their air-conditioned offices, hey, nothing against air-conditioned offices, but they when the world does not reflect what they want the world to reflect. You see a lot of people saying, this particular occupation should be paid more or something like that. Right? I'm like, you cannot, it comes, the intent, I would like to believe, comes from a very good place, but you have to realize the end that it creates in the world is pretty sinister, right? Because it means that for that to happen, so many people agency has to be invalidated for this vision that you have of the world to succeed, because clearly it does not match with reality. That is why you want reality to change. And I'm like, but if your premise for changing reality is not allowing people to change it themselves, then I think that you are already walking down a very treacherous path. And I think that's what a lot of people, state interventionists in general, which is what informs the logic of labor regulations like these, they lose sight of that. They think that there is a ideal like equality or social justice, as they would say, that is justifiable, that is strong enough to justify invalidating natural rights. And of course we disagree with that. So yeah, we hope they can see reality. We disagree because we are right, we are correct. Reality, as you said, just does not work like that, just creates more problems. And to Ayanda's point, right, the reality is we spawn out. The immigrants can't get employment in South Africa. Like most illegal immigrants that I know are actually employed, right? Which is something that, but most South Africans that I know are not employed. And I'm saying, let us change that. Let's change that, implement JSEC, at least like read the paper and think about it, right? I'm sure you'll be convinced.
Absolutely. No, thanks, Zakes. I think that's a good point to end it on. JSEC is all about restoring, firstly, recognizing people's agency. They are human beings and they can make decisions, even if we disagree with them, even if we think they are not making the best decision for themselves. They are the ones with the most up-to-date information about what is going to solve their problem in that moment. And them making that decision tells us plenty. It tells us more than enough that we need to know. They have chosen to take a job under conditions that they felt were superior to their unemployed status. And that is what JSEC enables. It recognizes agency and it respects dignity through that, because there is no dignity in being involuntarily unemployed. There is no dignity in that. That destroys morale, it destroys a sense of self, as X has explained. And it is ultimately a ticking time bomb, because a population can only take so much depression, really, what it comes down to, so much despair at their own state of perceived worthlessness, and the fact that perceived worthlessness is brought about by state policy is a very problematic state of affairs. So as Zakhele says, here's the paper. There you can see it on your screen. It's on the website of the Free Market Foundation right now, so you can read it. And please do get in touch with us if you're from the press. If you want to arrange an interview, we would be more than happy to oblige that. But I think that is it for us. Thank you to Zakhele for the presentation. Thank you to everyone who is watching from your offices and your homes. We really appreciate it. And thank you to the people asking questions. We are going to launch one more Liberty First paper. You will find all of the launched papers so far at libertyfirst.co.za. All of the press conferences that we've had, the videos are available there as well if you want to get into that. The next paper will be launched in, I believe, 2 weeks on the topic of sound money, of cryptocurrencies specifically, and what reforms can be done in that respect to get economic growth and economic freedom going in South Africa. But that's it for us for now. Have a good one, everyone. We will see you all soon.